So today we're going to be talking about the ethics of appropriation, and we're specifically going to look on whether it's okay to copy or borrow from others in art and culture. This topic really matters because it comes up in things like music and fashion and media, and there's not always really like a clear answer. And throughout this presentation, we're going to look at the different perspectives and examples so we can easier draw a line between inspiration and plagiarism. And of course, this is by Carlos, Emily, Isabella, and Melanie. So this leads to the main question of our whole presentation, which is it okay to copy? And there isn't really a simple answer because it depends on things like content and intent and if credit is given or not. And some people believe that all art can be influenced by other works, so copying is just like a part of being creative. But others think there is a line, and if you cross it, it becomes plagiarism or cultural appropriation. So as we go through this presentation, think about personally like where you would draw that line because it kind of depends on the person whether they consider that creativity or plagiarism. So what even is appropriation? So appropriation refers to the action of taking something for one's own use, often without the individual's permission. This could be cultural traditions, artwork, and ideas. Sometimes this can be seen as appreciating or maybe just like an influence, especially in art where people can build off of each other's work. But again, other times it can seem really unfair, like someone is taking from a culture without giving any credit. So overall, it is a little bit of like a gray area. But the main meaning of cultural appropriation is that it's taking something and using it for your own purpose.
This leads me to the historical and contextual information. So, the historical context of appropriation in art and culture specifically has spanned the entirety of humanity's existence. And then within this time, it's taken an array of forms from individuals seeking to learn traditions via imitation. For instance, younger generations learning traditions through imitation of cultural practices that help with preserving cultures. And then the more present issue, the topic of colonialism. In fact, cultural appropriation has now largely been associated with Western or white populations, as they have demonstrated their power in choosing which cultures to preserve and then which one to disregard. And this often turns into sort of a marketable product, especially with those that obviously they preserve, and just simply demonstrates their aim at, quite frankly, profiteering off of these individuals. And now leading us to our collective position, which we'll express in our next slide.
Hi, my name is Emily Perez, and I'll be introducing our collective position. When is appropriation considered harmful or unethical? Overall, our group believes that appropriation becomes unethical when it disrespects or exploits a culture. This can include situations where cultural elements are used to mock traditions, profit off marginalized groups, or remove the original meaning behind cultural practices. This demonstrates that the ethics of appropriation depend on how and why cultural elements are used, not just the act of borrowing itself.
So, in order to understand appropriation, we also need to understand the three main topics that go into it. So, we will introduce that in the next couple of slides, but they're going to be appropriation versus appreciation, power and inequality, and finally, respect and responsibility, all which have vital roles in what plays into appropriation.
One of our main topics that we're going to be discussing is appropriation versus appreciation. So this video is basically going to cover the difference between the two and explain how it is going to relate to our argument today.
As young children, we learned that everyone has the right to control the use of their property.
Hi.
Keep it, share it, give it away. It seemed that simple. But as adults, we find ourselves trying to navigate through physical and virtual worlds where issues of intellectual property and ownership are much more complex. Much of what is ethical and unethical in the area of intellectual property has to do with following the law. While laws governing appropriation and attribution are struggling to keep up and add clarity in our rapidly evolving world, ethical analysis can help guide the way.
I was a camp counselor for a couple of years, and once my kids graduate high school, they are fair game to add me on Facebook. I came across a photo that one of these teenagers had shared on her Facebook page that was a photo I had taken and posted to my Facebook page, and she didn't credit me or link me to the page. I had just come across it, and so I felt violated. If she had credited me for my work and just even tagged me or something, just mentioned my name of who had taken the photo, I really wouldn't have had a problem with it.
Attribution means giving credit where credit is due.
To be or not to be.
In theory, the author of any published work has a right to control how his or her intellectual property is used. But in practice, most people click agree when signing on to websites such as YouTube without ever being aware that they're signing over the rights to their material to the corporation that owns the site. We all know that we're not supposed to plagiarize our papers, but what about artists or musicians who learn their craft by copying famous predecessors? Would we call that stealing or influence?
Yeah. Copying someone's work directly with the intent of using it and passing it as your own, I think is definitely stealing, obviously so.
Intention matters, and I would never intend to steal something. I would do everything in my power to actively try not to, but there's a huge difference between influence and stealing.
Music professor and computer scientist David Cope created a computer program that produces original compositions in the style of Mozart or Bach, for instance, but it's not. 2 CDs have been produced and sold with no legal action taken because the copyrights to the individual works expired long ago. In another case, composer John Oswald created sound collages using samples of previously recorded works. He claimed that the sound collages were original compositions. He listed all his sources, but did not get permissions to use them. Record companies filed lawsuits, and ultimately, unsold copies of his albums were destroyed.
Even though music and sound are things that can be repurposed, I don't always think that it's necessarily the correct thing to do if you can't talk to someone who knew them and they would be okay with that.
There's very few things that have been original in this time era, so it's a matter of just like, you can't say I was the first to come up with it because there's always someone else who had.
Ethically speaking, using others' intellectual property for one's own gain without permission is stealing.
Yes.
But appropriation is more complex. Appropriation can mean borrowing ideas, images, symbols, sounds, and identity from others. Many would argue that progress in art, music, and architecture wouldn't even be possible without incorporating important artistic developments of the past. Sometimes appropriation is ethically permissible, and other times not. For example, many of our government buildings and banks have appropriated ancient Greek architectural features, such as columns and capitals, to project images we associate with democracy, wealth, and freedom. On the other hand, controversial instances of cultural appropriation abound, such as the NFL's use of Native American symbols like the logo for the Washington Redskins.
My friends and I were actually talking recently about Miley Cyrus and how she's kind of shifting from one image to more of an African American influence. If we asked our African American friends what they would think about that, what would their reactions be? And that's almost like sampling of an entire culture rather than just like a series of notes or a beat.
If you come across an artist and you really like how they did a certain skill or a process, it's okay to take that and try to make it your own. And I guess in a more professional setting, you do want to cite that effort that someone else made just to pay respect to that person. That's definitely something that's taught in the art world.
When it comes to appropriation and attribution, the laws may still be murky, but ethical behavior doesn't have to be. If what you want to use doesn't belong to you, then use it only in ways that the owner permits. If it's impossible to ask for permission, then ask yourself how you would want the creation to be used or attributed if it were your own. And if ownership itself is a subject of debate, then the use should be subjected to a systematic moral analysis to determine what harms the appropriation might cause and whether they are justified.
The thought of people stealing my work, it does bother me and it does upset me, and it almost angers me in a way to know that someone could get away with that.
If you're borrowing material from an artist, you definitely need permission for that, just because that artist worked very hard on that, regardless if it's music or art or writing.
It's a good idea to give credit and also put in your own style, because whenever you do create art or something like that, you're taking from another idea that was already there, and you need to be influenced some way or another.
Understanding appropriation. Appropriation refers to the action of taking something of one's own use, often without the individual's permission. This could be cultural, traditional artworks, and ideas, which we are all going to basically cover in this presentation. Understanding appreciation. Merriam-Webster basically says that appreciation is a feeling or expression of admiration, approval, or gratitude. And we are going to be uncovering the difference between appreciation and appropriation in all of these different articles and different aspects of our world and our culture.
So the second big idea is power and inequality, which kind of explains the more manipulative side of appropriation, which I'll cover in these upcoming slides. So power is effectively how much influence a certain individual or group has on another individual or group. And secondly, we have inequality, which basically refers to the unequal or uneven distribution of opportunities for an individual or group. So we have the textbook definition of inequality on the screen, but the way that basically ties into appropriation is how, especially with cultural appropriation, a lot of more powerful groups will take advantage of this inequality that they have and try to take advantage of certain aspects going back to cultural appropriation, like traditions or cultural values that a minority or smaller group has, for various reasons, which we'll touch on later on in the slides.
It is really important to understand these two key ideas, which is respect and responsibility. When we talk about appropriation, it's not just about copying, it's about how you treat other people's work and their culture. And respecting it and having responsibility can help us decide what's okay and what's not. When it comes to using something that isn't originally ours, or when it comes to like taking something from somebody else, it's always important to keep respect and responsibility in the back of your mind. So the first one is understanding respect, and this involves one, placing value on others' feelings and rights, especially in an understanding manner. Respect means like recognizing and valuing other people's feelings. And again, when it comes to appropriation, it means understanding where something is coming from without not thinking about where this first is originating. For example, if somebody would use elements from another culture without actually understanding it or giving credit, it can come off as very disrespectful. So, respect is really just about being more aware and thoughtful of when you're using something that's not your own. The next one is understanding responsibility. So, responsibility acknowledges one's ownership of their actions and duties. Personal accountability is a prime example where an individual has to own their actions and choices, and most importantly, consequences. So, it's mostly just about taking ownership over your actions and being aware of those consequences. It could mean just giving credit or asking permission or making sure you're not misinterpreting something. It's honestly just being more mature about how you handle situations, especially how you handle taking something that isn't yours. And if you do it incorrectly, you have to be okay with the repercussions and be responsible for them.
And here's a slide of all the essays that we'll cover. Each one of us will discuss, rather, and we are pulling these essays from our textbook. So for this topic, I decided to focus on the bane of cultural appropriation written by Keenan Malik. So providing a brief overview of what Keenan Malik presents, he first brings up the controversy with cultural appropriation and how it's being incorporated by public figures. And he expresses how these cultures expressed by these public figures are cultures that they're not a part of. And so I present an image, in fact, an example that he shows, which is Beyonce dressed in Bollywood attire. And she does that in a music video by Coldplay. And along with that, he further ties in the issue of 18th century Europe, where a cultural movement made a major shift towards creating universalism, advocated by radicals. This movement would ensure that negative or harmful aspects of identity politics would not exist. So, frankly, colonialist acts. However, he noted how this transitioned into racial stereotypes that alienated individuals from cultural traditions, and further perpetuate aspects of power and inequality. And so another instance, or rather example that he shows is how this notion of saying that it is authentic for blacks to wear locks, or even for Native Americans to wear a headdress, further, emphasizes or rather puts these cultural traditions and these individuals in a cohort, and thereby now allowing them to express themselves outwardly. And then, along with that, lastly, rather, he acknowledges how allowing all the individuals to participate upon the removal of cultural gatekeepers will create a more progressiveness and interconnectedness among everyone, and all cultures will be appreciative. And this ties into the next slide, which is the argument that he comes up with. Keenan includes an explicit argument at the very end of his paper, stating the real fight against injustice begins with ridding ourselves of our self-appointed gatekeepers. He strives to demonstrate that cultural appreciation is only achievable when cultures are shared in a respectful manner, and he understands that the primary barrier to this is the abundance of individuals acting as self-appointed cultural leaders. Ultimately, Keenan advocates for breaking the power of these intermediaries so that people can engage with one another as individuals rather than as representatives of tribes. So now touching on the pathos, logos, and ethos of his essay. Now addressing the pathos, logos, and ethos aspects of Keenan's essay. Starting with pathos, Keenan incorporates a pessimistic and concerning tone throughout his essay, Moreover, his proclaimed statements address the current cultural movement and its embodiment of cultural ownership as a manner to assert racial power. His disapproval for the cultural direction is even demonstrated by his diction, such as culture do not and cannot work through notions of ownership. So that ownership aspect of it. And then Logos Keenan provides a strong and logical reasoning for his anti-appropriation argument. For instance, the historical reference, of 18th century Europe and their universalist perspective tied how this idea at base value should be reimplemented. Additionally, he addresses all sides of this cultural embodiment, especially when talking about the stereotypes. In fact, Keenan exemplifies this best when he said, by dressing up like a fake Indian, one Native American told white students, you are asserting your power over us and continuing to oppress us. And so, lastly, ethos. Keenan is a noble writer and is a trained neurobiology and a history science. He trained in both neurobiology, and history of science. And then similarly, he has long focused on the philosophy of biology and contemporary theories of multiculturalism, pluralism, and race, which makes him a great and credible author. Concluding this essay, I would like to leave you guys with one big question, and that is, could a universalist ideal, where everyone can participate equally, be probable or possible in this day and age?
While a group believes appropriation becomes unethical when it is harmful or exploitative, Yoseshi's work, What's Mine is Yours, shows that the issue is more complex and that cultural exchange can also be positive depending on context and intention. Throughout his work, he explores the debate around cultural appropriation and argues that it is not simply right or wrong, but a complex issue. So, a little overview, I will discuss the 3 topics, go over ethos, pathos, logos, and lastly, I will discuss the implicit/explicit argument. One of our topics is appropriation versus appreciation. So, she connects appropriation versus appreciation by using real-life examples of celebrities. Pharrell Williams faced backlash for wearing a Native American headdress, stated in page 506. The top image is Pharrell Williams in an ad wearing the headdress. Another example is Katy Perry was criticized for adopting geisha-style clothing, stated in page 506. The bottom image is her performing at the music awards in the geisha-style clothing. These examples demonstrate how cultural borrowing can be seen as appropriation when it lacks understanding or even respect. Another topic is power and inequality. To add on, she highlights power and inequality by showing how dominant groups can profit from minority cultures. Iggy Azalea was accused of benefiting from Black cultural music without fully acknowledging its origins. The African-American rapper Azealia Banks suggested that Azalea's cultural smudging was yet another careless instance of cross-racial stealing, stated in page 506. This demonstrates unequal power where some groups gain recognition while others are overlooked. Another topic was respect and responsibility. So she also emphasizes respect and responsibility by explaining how certain cultural items have deep meaning. The bottom of page 505 to the beginning of 506, so she states how Native American headdresses are not fashion items but can hold cultural and spiritual significance, so wearing something like that as a costume can be seen as insensitive, which is a reason why Pharrell Williams gained backlash. Moving on to logos, he explains that culture is not something that is permanent, yet it is constantly changing, as he stated, which insists that culture, by its nature, a commonly forged and ever-changing project. Zushi, page 506. This quote helps support his argument that cultural exchange is natural and not always harmful. As for pathos, he explains pathos by showing the emotional impact of cultural appropriation. He uses the wording ignorant harvesting, stated in page 506. This adds emotion because it suggests that people are unfairly taken from others without respect. This can provide a clearer understanding of why some individuals may feel offended or frustrated when their culture is used this way. As for ethos, he uses ethos by referencing credible sources and real debates. For example, he writes, recently in The Guardian, stated in page 506, just by citing a well-known publication and then goes on to explain the discussions, He builds credibility and shows that his argument is based on real world issues. Moving on to the last slide, the weakness of Yosushi is that he remains neutral and does not fully support one side. His implicit versus explicit argument is that Yosushi's explicit argument is that cultural appropriation is complex and depends on context, meaning it can be both harmful and beneficial. His implicit argument is that culture should not be strictly owned or controlled, and that cultural exchange is a natural part of society. Overall, Zashi's work shows that the ethics of appropriation depends on context, power, and respect, rather than being right or wrong. A question I will leave you with is, do you think cultural appropriation does more harm than good, or is it necessary for culture to grow? Thank you.
So, the piece of evidence that I chose to look at from our casebook was an article from an author, Kay Bradford, who graduated from NYU, and she works as an author specializing in fantasy and sci fi novels. And she's been doing this for quite a bit of time. But her essay is titled Cultural Appropriation is, in fact, Indefensible. And she went ahead and made the claim that cultural appropriation throughout different art forms is harmful and completely avoidable as a whole. And she went on to explain this by making the difference between appropriation and exchange. Or, as previously said in the past couple slides, exchange, appreciation, used interchangeably. But what the author goes ahead and says is that a lot of the times people don't really know what appropriation is, and that's why they argue that appropriation can be positive sometimes. A lot of people think, oh, appropriation, well, isn't that just when maybe a less discriminated group takes a cultural aspect of a more marginalized group and then shares what it is? And no, that's more of an exchange, if done respectfully, of course. Appropriation is when a group with more power uses or less inequality takes an aspect, a cultural aspect of a more marginalized group, and will do things like profit off of it or misrepresent it in not a very nice light. Or maybe do things like use sacred garments, kind of like taboo things with their culture. And that's what appropriation is. So even though the author, when I first saw the title, I was like, whoa, that title itself, complete hasty generalization, because the author is making it seem like all appropriation is bad. But after she defined appropriation as just the negative aspects of sharing, and then explained the confusion between appropriation and appreciation, it was a lot easier to agree with what she was saying. So, looking at Bradford's essay through the three different lenses, first we have ethos. So, I went ahead and did some research on Bradford, and yes, like I previously mentioned, she graduated from NYU, and she also does have a more specialization towards um, teaching and educating on how to be respectful when it comes to representing minorities in media. Because she is an author, so she did, I found out, have this one class about, and she does mention this in her article, how she has a class where she teaches other authors how to create characters who are not like you, respectfully. So when you have a character of a different ethnicity or race in your book that you're writing, she would teach you how to properly incorporate them in there without, maybe some accidental racism or other things like that. So the pathos that she also included in her essay, I did notice that she had a very serious tone and also very passionate. I could sense her anger through her words, um, because of the phrases that she used about describing minorities who are taken advantage of as systemically oppressed, and the actions that maybe the people with the greater power used as harmful. And finally, looking at it through a logical lens or logos, she did make a very good argument that she did back up with explaining how appropriation and exchange are not the same. Appropriation is harmful. Appropriation is systemically oppressing. It's when people harmfully try to share values of minority groups but they don't do it respectfully. An exchange is when two parties involved, the higher up party and maybe the minority power party, it's good representation. The party with higher power doesn't take advantage of them, doesn't profit, doesn't um, include any racist or oppressive statements in their artwork. However, one flaw that I did notice within the essay was that the author didn't really take on an approach that both parties are equal. Throughout the essay, she was trying to make it seem like in order for appropriation to happen, one party had to have more power while the other party had to be less power or be more marginalized. She didn't really include a case where both parties could be both marginalized, or maybe one party um, didn't wasn't as powerful. So I just thought that was interesting to think about. So while reading Bradford's article, I am a bit of a Lana Del Rey fan, and I was immediately reminded of something that happened to Lana Del Rey back a couple years ago. As you know, she is a famous pop star, and I wanted to include these screenshots of a music video that she made in 2012 called Ride, where Del Rey, she doesn't have any affiliation or background with the Native American heritage, and she decided to wear a Native American headpiece, which is seen as extremely sacred to Native Americans in her music video. And Del Rey intended this to be a very respectful thing. She even came out in interviews after the video and said it was supposed to be an ode to the spirit of dance and freedom that she experienced while working on the Indian reservations that she shot her music video. Because the video took place in like the middle of a desert, so in a reservation. And she faced extreme backlash from this. As you can see, a lot of her fans were really quick to say that, hey, her actions were not okay. She even faced criticism from some Native American tribes as well for wearing that sacred headpiece that's intended for normally people like um, warriors in a tribe or leaders in a tribe, not for anyone outside of the Native American heritage to wear. So when you do a quick Google search on Lana Del Rey headpiece, Native American headpiece, you can see all of these different results coming up. And so that's when I thought back to the article, and I wanted to leave some questions for you guys to think about. So, how can people from a non marginalized group share or experience art and traditions from a marginalized group? And then, secondly, is appropriation justified when the artist has pure intention? So, in this example, like Del Rey, even though she claimed that it was supposed to be a tribute to the Native American people because of the sense of freedom she got driving through the reservations, was it justified or was it not? Because remember, she did still profit off of this music video. And then finally, who decides what counts as appropriation? And what if all the members of the marginalized group do not see the action as appropriation?
I'm going to be talking about the article A Food Fight at Orland College by Connor Fridersdorf. And basically, he was a graduate of Pomona University and NYU, and he works for the publication Atlantic, where he mostly writes about politics and international affairs. And he wrote this article on December 12th, 2015 for the Atlantic. He basically talks about Orland College and how students were upset at the food served and how it was serving as cultural appropriation towards Asian cuisine at the time. So Connor's argument throughout this entire article was that the food service vendors at Orland College have no respect for cultural cuisine and is changing the original recipes. This is blurring the line between cultural diversity and cultural appropriation by showing no respect for certain Asian recipes and customs. So basically, the staff was changing recipes to certain meals and were giving it to students, and students recognized this and basically tried to point this out to the universities and saying that, oh, this isn't very kind to my culture. It wasn't a good representation of what the school should be about. Appropriation versus appreciation. So these are reflecting on our main points as a group. And basically, the school was taking recipes and taking culture, a part of somebody's culture, and they weren't appreciating it as much as they should have been. They weren't showing any admiration towards it and were kind of putting it down in a sense. Power and equality, the school was basically overpowering the students and showing that they could do whatever they wanted, and it wasn't really showing any equality between them and the students, or showing that the students basically didn't have any power in the situation and couldn't really do anything about it. They tried, of course, but it was kind of showing that the school didn't really see themselves as equals, as adults in this situation, and they put the students down. Respect and responsibility, the school was basically not showing any respect towards any of these Asian cultures and the foods that they have in their cultures, and they weren't taking any responsibilities for their actions. So the ethos that Connor represents in his article is that he references students' complaints and campus events from the college. So he basically takes real examples from people at that college witnessing these events and takes events from the college that are also happening and puts those in his article as his evidence. Pathos, it mostly is reflective of frustration from the students, which resonates throughout his entire article and kind of reflects on him a little bit. He also shows some concern for the students and some empathy for them for what they are going through at the school at the time as well. Logos, he mostly does cause and effect, with students' minor concerns affecting how it can diminish the meaning of activism and serious concerns that are happening in this world, and how it can kind of make it seem like serious concerns aren't as important as they are. And that's mainly his logos for majority of this argument, or majority of this essay. Some logical fallacies that Connor includes in his argument is slippery slope, which he basically just says, because of this happened, and he keeps going down that train of events. So basically, as I said before, the complaints about the food are diminishing activism and serious issues, which make them lose credibility in people's eyes. And he basically does this throughout his entire evidence in this article. Oversimplification, he uses a lot of bad food, like quote unquote bad food, bad cafeteria food, and it's oversimplifying what the students actually are meaning and what they are actually trying to say, which is cultural respect isn't being established, cultural representation also isn't being established, and a lot of the students are feeling marginalized. But instead of saying that, he is summing it all up and saying that the cafeteria food is bad. A similar event to Connor's article is in 2019. Gordon Ramsay opened up a restaurant called London's Lucky Cat, and it was set to serve authentic Asian cuisine, but reporters and critiques, mostly Angelia Hui, took to the internet and said otherwise, according to Match.com. She basically wrote a bunch of bad reviews about this restaurant, saying it wasn't as authentic as Gordon said it was, and that it didn't really taste the same, and it wasn't as related to her culture as he says it was. And he wrote back on the internet basically saying that I will appreciate any honest criticism, but if you're going to write critiques about my restaurant and about me, make sure it's right, and make sure you're not just saying it because I'm a public figure. Be respectable. So, and it wasn't just her that wrote about this restaurant. There were a lot of different reporters that wrote about this restaurant not being as authentic as he says. So he faced a lot of criticism for this. Some questions to consider from this article are, how can smaller issues, like how Connor says is food representation, reflect larger systematic problems that we would consider today? Like anything politics or anything regarding the environment. Would they consider that on a similar scale, and how would they be kind of related to each other? And then another question is, should activism focus on how their actions are perceived by the public, or should they focus solely on addressing issues they see as important? And then please explain why you think this. Basically, should they focus on what the public wants, or should they focus on what they want to address, what they feel is important? And I feel like that goes a big way on morals and how people would view what is important in this world. And that's the big question that people need to consider.
So the essay that I chose was The Freewheel and Bob Dylan by Andrea Pitzer. And just for an overview, Andrea Pitzer's essay dives into the cultural appropriation by looking at how Bob Dylan created his career by borrowing from other artists. Back in the 1960s, doing this was not out of the ordinary because songs could be shared. However, originality is much more sacred now, which is why Pitzer questions if Bob Dylan is crossing a line into plagiarism. So building kind of off of this, one important thing to understand is that Bob Dylan wasn't just like randomly copying. He was a part of a tradition where artists reshaped older material. In folk music, especially, like songs are passed down and changed over time. So the idea of ownership was more flexible than it would be nowadays. But what makes him different is that he became famous and successful while using this approach. And the issue isn't really just that he borrowed, it's just that he benefited from it so much, which raises the ethical question of if it is just crossing over the line because he benefited so much from this so-called plagiarism. And that's what she wants us to think about. The next portion of this is going to be talking about her argument structure. So Pitzer's main point is that Bob Dylan relied on borrowing, which makes it difficult to call his work creative. She goes into how Dylan's Noble lecture has 20 identical sentences to Spark Notes for Moby Dick. And in this, so she's basically talking about, obviously Bob Dylan had this like Nobel lecture and he talked about Moby Dick, and even when he's not writing songs, even in just a lecture, he was kind of just borrowing and copying. And that was her point into adding this in there, is that it's not just when he writes songs, but it's also in his speeches. And which is why this is such a strong argument, because she shows that Bob Dylan has done this multiple times throughout his career, and it's not just a one-time occurrence. And the sources that he borrows from aren't just traditional folk songs, like they include a lot of modern materials like study guides like Spark Notes, which is just a very big overall borrowing that he's doing, and it's not just from one thing, it's from multiple things. The next section is the evaluation, which we're going to talk about the ethos, logos, and pathos. So for ethos, she shows both sides of the issue, which makes her very credible because she's not just being biased to one side. Her pathos is she's very skeptical and ironic, which makes the reader be uncertain in Bob Dylan's work because the writer's uncertain. And then her logos is one of the strongest because she incorporates a lot of evidence in her essay to support her claim. Also, her tone plays a really big role because instead of being overly aggressive, she uses a lot of like subtle examples that kind of just make the reader question things on their own without being forced to question them, which is a lot more effective than her just saying, oh, this is wrong. And she kind of just makes the reader slowly question and slowly be skeptical about Bob Dylan's creativity, just like she is. And she just makes her argument because she doesn't really fully attack him head on, and she just lets the evidence speak for itself. And this really just makes the reader believe her more because she's not pointing fingers and she's just stating facts. A similar example to cultural appropriation in music is Elvis Presley, who became famous performing rock and roll, which is actually a genre that originated from the African American community. And this is just a really good example that it's not really just about borrowing, it's just about who gets recognized and who profits from it, which connects back Dylan because it raises the question of whether success changes how we judge appropriation. Because if you think about it, if Bob Dylan or Elvis Presley never became famous, nobody would know that they were borrowing or that they were kind of playing into this appropriation. And it just kind of raises like more questions about if these people weren't successful, would appropriation even really be an issue? Just like Elvis, he really brought rock and roll to mainstream, but it wasn't even him that created it in the first place. So it's just a food for thought of if they weren't even successful, would this be an issue? And for the last part, for more of a discussion, overall, Pitzer concludes that being original is a lot superior over borrowing, and the standards should apply to all generations of art and music. And the first question is, where is the line between appropriation and plagiarism? The second question is, should artists be judged on today's standards or the past? And the third question is, can anything in art really ever be 100% original? So to kind of add on to these, something else to think about is how much intent really matters. Like, does it make a difference if the artist didn't mean to copy versus if they did do it intentionally? And also, with how connected everything is today, it's so much easier to trace where ideas came from, where they couldn't really do that in the past because they simply just didn't have the technology to do it. So, overall, it's not really just about Bob Dylan, but it's about how we define creativity in general and whether originality is even a realistic thing anymore.
So now that we've gone ahead and defined what exactly appropriation is and how it's harmful to different minorities or different cultures, how can we solve this issue? Our group came to the conclusion that education and awareness can both help the artists be more respectful when it comes to their approach on trying to share different cultural values, as well as the viewer or reader or consumer of whatever the art may be, literature, media, different mediums. So, on the education side, artists can do research on the group that they are trying to portray beforehand. This is to basically get rid of any negative stereotypes they might have included in the art, any racial profiling, any negative stereotypes being portrayed. Another thing the artists can do is look up the proper etiquette that goes into borrowing a culture's art. So, what is sacred and what is okay to use? So, like back in my article, the Lana Del Rey example, she probably shouldn't have worn a very sacred garment to wear it in her video, given that she has no Native American background. Um, and on the more awareness side, uh, to spread awareness of the cultural appropriation, the viewers can or consumers can hold the artists accountable when they see that an artist is taking part in cultural appropriation, whatever the type of medium it may be. And then another way that the viewers or consumers can help fight against cultural appropriation, sorry, is trying to support small vendors or artisans that are from the culture and not giant corporations that are trying to profit. So maybe if you do want to buy an indigenous art piece that you think is really cool, instead of buying it off of Amazon, which probably manufactured it somewhere not from a actual legit source, you can maybe go to an artisan online, or maybe a small business vendor on Etsy or somebody who's actually from that background. And then finally, from the viewer's perspective, look at the power dynamics that are being portrayed. Is a more powerful group trying to profit off of a more marginalized group? And if so, what would you do about it?